what I'd really like to ask you about is where, I think, are very kind of invested in exploring how Fanon utilizes Lacan and how Fanon utilizes psychoanalysis more generally. But what's also crucial is to be clear on where Fanon pushes back against psychoanalysis. So you've just noted parts where, and I think very helpfully, where Fanon thinks psychoanalysis is not particularly helpful. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this, because how you've thought about this has been, kind of influential and very helpful to me. But in what respects is Fanon most cautious, and in what respects does he need another theoretical paradigm altogether, or indeed a recourse to the experience of the black man, as the one title of Black Skin, White Mask goes, rather than simply appealing to psychoanalysis? What are the limits of psychoanalysis for Lacan, in short?
I think that the only way to think about this really is to think about, Fanon's use in Black Skin, White Masks of the concept of objectivity, of rationality, and a kind of paradigm of Western thought that he often, whenever he's talking about these things, he's being quite ironic or dismissive. So I think at one point he says, the Catholic Church first justified and then condemned slavery. And then he says the scientific community similarly first tried to justify racism before deciding actually there was no scientific reason or basis for racism. And what he's saying is that ultimately the science has disproven that Black and brown people and people of color are inferior to white people. And yet, in spite of the scientific evidence, racism persists. So that rationalism was not a moment, it wasn't a light bulb moment, which extinguished colonization, which extinguished racism, etc. And I think that it was in this context I started thinking about how does Fanon approach the double question? As far as I can tell, a lot of Fanon's work is, on the one hand, thinking about the Black man and about people of color and colonized people within this paradigm of oppression. But on the other hand, there's very much a critique of the paradigm itself. So the critique of whiteness, the critique of rationalism, the critique of objectivity, the critique of the paradigm of oppression. And you can see how they both kind of connect. And I noticed that the kind of methodological strategy that Fanon adopted was that he would always talk about psychoanalysis when talking about kind of white colonizing power or people or oppression or system structures. And I think that I'm glad to think that you think that this theory holds. And maybe you can say a bit more about that in a second. But I think that what's interesting about that is that it then, the status of psychoanalysis within Fanon, because we know we've all had these feelings for a very long time within the scholarship. Different people have thought it. It's not a new idea that Fanon obviously pulls for psychoanalytic concepts. Whether it's hallucination or fantasy or paranoia. And Fanon, as I described earlier, is steeped in psychoanalytic training. The journals, the Psychoanalysis Society of Paris journals, etc. The fact that he quotes Marie Bonaparte, etc., as well as Lacan, but Adler, Freud, Jung. He has a lot to say, but I think that where people have struggled is that he often says that we cannot psychoanalyze the Black man, that the Black man we cannot apply these theories to the Black man. But that doesn't make Fanon any less of a psychoanalyst. What he's saying is you cannot psychoanalyze a man in a cage, right? You have to release people, you have to free them. And I think that, there's a reoccurring motif in Fanon, lâchez-les, set them free. And I think that that's what he ultimately wants. There's no point spending time trying to psychoanalyze the mind of a colonized person because they're directly under oppression and starvation and God knows what. And I think that's the point. And so, but the key question is how to use psychoanalysis, which he himself says he consents to use, because he doesn't think necessarily that philosophy is a good methodological strategy. He says, I consent to use psychoanalysis, but for what aim? Well, to understand the entire complex problem of colonization, to understand the colonial paradigm and the colonial framework through this kind of social theory that psychoanalysis can offer. And I think that it's some of the most prescient and powerful moments in the book when he begins to deconstruct in this way these colonial moments through psychoanalysis. And I think that's partly why he was so upset with Mannoni in the book, with Octave Mannoni in his book, because Mannoni tried to psychoanalyze the kind of indigenous, if you want to, the native, entre parenthèses, population, whereas I think that Fanon wants to utilize psychoanalysis to understand the white man and to understand why the white man has decided to pursue all this oppression. But it's just conjecture. What do you think?
Well, I mean, we could complicate it a little bit, but let's say that I think you could say two symptomatic moments in Black Skin, White Masks, probably more. The woman of color, I know nothing about her, which people critique him for, but in a way, much inspired by you, I want to read that as, okay, you could critique Fanon for it. But is he also not wanting to say, given that the immediate pre-context for that is he's talking psychoanalytically and in a kind of psychoanalytically interpretive, problematizing, scrutinizing manner, you could say, that in a sense, I'm not going to do that right here and now. And of course, we also have this moment in other respects in Black Skin, White Masks, where he says, for example, there is no Oedipus complex in the Antilles. So, lots of commentators say, well, actually, Stuart Hall amongst them, well, maybe there is actually. So my point here is to say that it's not that Fanon is unaware of how psychoanalysis could be utilized in those situations. And of course, one of the ways where he seems to break his own rule is when he does talk about Meyer Capiche's, sorry, I can't do the French translation like you can, Je suis Martiniquais. I can't say that. You'll have Sinan.
You've done very well, I thought.
Okay, well, thanks. So, at sometimes he seems to do that, but I think what you write about, or I think you're right in entirety, but one doesn't use psychoanalysis to go prior to the event of colonization, which is exactly what Mannoni does. Number two, if you are going to use it, it's most applicable to a pathological scene. Right. So early on in Black Skin, White Mask, he says, well, we need some philosophical engagements. I think he's trying to suggest we need an existentialist approach, but we also sometimes have to address failures, as in the case of an engine failure. And, my reading of that is, well, psychoanalysis comes about precisely to treat pathologies, right? And so it's a kind of praxis, it's a kind of discourse that does that. Now, I think Fanon needs that. And that's how to understand his utilization of psychoanalysis. When there is suffering, when there is a pathology of the colonial situation, then it's not enough simply to do an existential analysis of it. You need some kind of utopian, revolutionary, political dilemma situation, series of concepts to think beyond that, to be fundamentally revolutionary, to bring it to an end. And if we're going to say that psychoanalysis is a kind of tragic theory, which he does at some point, then maybe it's not good for that. But what it is good for, and what other theories don't necessarily do enough, give us enough leverage, is in terms of addressing the failings, the crisis, the pathology. And maybe just the last point then, when he does seem to do psychoanalysis of the woman of color, as in, chapter 2, my reading of that would be that it's about a pathology which is inherent to the colonial situation as such. So I don't think he is pathologizing individuals there. I think he's pathologizing, well, not pathology, is addressing something that's an inherent pathology of the racist, anti-Black colonial setting as such. So I think those are useful ways of thinking about limits to how Fanon would want to utilize psychoanalysis. Maybe with that, we could move on to a slightly different conceptualization, a slightly different question.
Would it be all right just to add one thing? Because I think I was reading in sort of Dying Colonialism, in that really amazing chapter on the Voice of Algeria, the radio program. I And there's this wonderful moment where he's talking about that the radio was a kind of tool of colonial administration. It was a tool for the colonizer in Algeria, and that only French settlers would actually listen to the radio in Algeria. And then he says there was a kind of wide mistrust amongst the Algerian population for the radio because it was seen as this foreign element. But then through a whole series of different strategies, the resistance decided to employ the radio for its own purposes, and so started airing programs on the radio, describing victories in battle and describing their side and kind of beefing up their kind of propaganda for the resistance. And Fanon describes it beautifully, but there's a kind of immediate pushback from the colonial authorities, who suddenly realize that, well, actually, no, they shouldn't be listening to the radio. They shouldn't be utilizing the radio for their own aims. The airwaves are ours, and it should be for kind of French propaganda, etc. And so they start to disrupt the sales of batteries. Of course, a lot of these radios that were bought by Algerians, they lived in the countryside. They didn't have any electricity or whatever. So they started disrupting the sale of batteries. And of course, then what happened was that there was a black market in batteries that flourished. So the colonial administration couldn't get them off the radio. So then the French decided that they were going to intervene right at the level of the radio. And they decided that they were going to drown out the colonial, the kind of resistance programs by playing white noise over it. And the reason why I mentioned this in the context of that discussion we had on psychoanalysis is because I don't know what to make of it, but this is a very clear example of Fanon using psychoanalysis to understand resistance within the colonial situation. And he says that, lots of Algerians would put their ears right up against the radio, and they would tune the radio over the white noise to try and catch, little snippets of the discussion of the resistance. And then he says it's almost a kind of an almost paranoid hallucination. These Algerian resistance sympathizers would imagine in the white noise the victory battles that would boost morale anyway. And then they would go into the street and speak to each other about totally hallucinated, delusional things that never actually occurred, but that they imagined. And in that imagination, it galvanized the Algerian population to maintain support for the resistance. So there's this wonderful moment with this radio and this analysis, is very, as far as I can tell, psychoanalytic argument to maintain the resistance in Algeria that, again, I don't know, might not necessarily fit into this kind of broad view that I suggested, was at least applicable to a large extent in Black Skin, White Masks. But what do you make of that? What do you think?
Well, it prompts a lot of thoughts, actually. There's these odd sort of historical, I don't know if we're talking deferred action here, but sometimes one, especially if one's thinking Lacanian psychoanalysis and Fanon's decolonial project, you put some of these texts alongside one another. And if you had to do this, it's not a competition, but 52, we have Black Skin, White Masks, and Lacan seminar, despite Lacan being older, doesn't begin in earnest, until whatever. Well, around about that. Okay, let's say 53, if I remember correctly. That's when we're doing a function field and then begins. But so there's moments when Fanon seems to anticipate something, an idea that will go on to be of significance for Lacan. There's multiple of these. And there's this odd sort of synergy of sorts, despite that they don't necessarily know each other. I mean, you can give us historical details about that. My point here is not that we always necessarily need to make a direct contact point, but it's to me, it feels as if Fanon reading as much, imbibing as much psychiatric, philosophical, psychoanalytic, psychological, social psychological theory has a good enough understanding of rudimentary Lacanian concepts to anticipate moments in later Lacan. And what I think you so nicely point to there, and it's a kind of theme I've been wondering about, particularly in reference to this idea that, well, if psychoanalysis is a discourse which treats suffering, which is a kind of ethical discourse of treatment, and it's also kind of somehow centralizes castration and is hence somehow tragic, that it's both useful to Fanon and has its limits. But to get to the point, one of the things which I think is really interesting about Black Skin, White Masks is the temporality, the mode of temporality that he envisages there. And his general project is one that cannot be sunk in terms of a constant, let's think back to the historical antecedents. There's an impetus to the futurity of the beyond of this moment, which is very, very crucial to Black Skin, White Masks. The moment is not today. The revolution, it's not the day we will hope. It'll be the explosion is not today. You know, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's also, I think, related to that comment about, you know, the relative opacity. Each generation must face its challenge and so on and so forth. So there's a strong current of a kind of futurity in Fanon, which I think, I don't know, I haven't thought it through, but it's also very crucial to Lacanian psychoanalysis. But I'm kind of tempted to say that Fanon gets there first because of the very absolute political necessity of seeing beyond the colonial context. So elsewhere, I've tried to wonder about this and say, could we say, I think we can make this argument, that Lacanian psychoanalysis, because of all of these moments, logical time, not just the Lacanian re-engagement with après coup, deferred action, but logical time, anticipatory certitude, a lot of temporal signatures in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And this also links to the technique of suspending a moment, of the Zeigarnik effect, whereby the subject is induced to finish a phrase that's begun. A lot of this temporality in Lacanian psychoanalysis is significant, I think, and it bears the imprint of Heidegger actually also, because it wants to somehow facilitate the subject's project of putting one foot into the future that hasn't yet come. Anyways, long spiel, but one of the things that you've made me think about is that I think that in some ways, the temporality that Fanon is speaking about in Black Skin, White Masks, a potential temporality of political change and a revolutionary temporality as an interesting, if as of yet under-articulated relationship to how Lacan is trying to think about some of these things in a different register, so to speak.